This is Penn Woods. I'm interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. The date is August the 24th, 1970. I'm at the home of Mr. J C Harlow. That's Jonathan Clare Harlow, of one of many very distinguished Harlows in Oklahoma, and one of the owners of the Harlow Publishing Company for many, many years, which published books in Oklahoma. I'll go from now to talk a little bit with Mr. Harlow. Mr. Harlow, I wonder, to begin with, if you would tell us about your birth and your parentage and when you came to Oklahoma.
We were the children of Dr. James Harlow of Lincoln County, Missouri, the second county north of St. Louis. He started the practice of medicine there in 1873. A widower, he married my mother in 1875, and naturally, as in those days was fashionable, there was a large family. My brother Victor was the eldest, and I was next to the bottom. The children came pretty regularly, every 2.5 years doing that. We all grew up to be country school teachers, except one. And he turned out the only one who can use the word doctor as it applies to the healing arts. The rest of them, some of them have doctor attached to them, but they are not of the healing arts. My father died in 1932. He was born in 1838. He lived fairly well. Mother died at the age of 96. She was the daughter of slaveholders. He was a Union soldier. He was a lifelong Illinois Democrat. She was a Republican. It's just a little unusual combination.
Why don't you, among the Harlow sons, why don't you give us the order of birth of the group, the Harlow group, beginning, I believe, with Victor Harlow?
Well, now, I might not be able to give it exactly, but there's Victor, born in 1876, I believe. Ernest in 1879. Harry would be in 81. I came along in 1889. And Rex was born in 1892. That was the 5 sons. We had 3 sisters. Quite a family.
You came to Oklahoma after World War I. Tell us about your service in World War I. What were you with in?
In World War I went into the Army in 1917 about as green a rookie as ever put on a uniform. And I was quite fortunate in that I went to the officers training camp as a sergeant, and I got my commission in 1918. And I was assigned to the 50th Infantry, which is the 20th Division, an old regular Army unit with traditions as full of traditions as a hound puppy is of fleas. The colonel had enlisted as a private in 1892. The lieutenant colonel had been with Shafter in Cuba. The captain of Company D had helped chase Aguinaldo. The supply sergeant of Company A had been at the Great Wall of China. They were old-timers in there, and we new lieutenants, 30-day wonders they called us, and I think it was properly applied. We had a bunch of West Pointers and a bunch of Eastern college graduates who had gone through their OTC and been commissioned, and some of them knew a lot and some thought they knew a lot. And, we got along all right together. We had a little lieutenant from Georgia, Henry Lord Page King from Georgia. And he was a carpet knight. He was afraid of a horse, but he had to ride. He was the adjutant to the major, and he had to ride a horse. And if you gave him anything more active than bigger than an old goat, why, he was extremely uncomfortable. But more about him later.
You came to Oklahoma following World War I. Why don't you tell us about Oklahoma City as it was? Was it Oklahoma City you came to first? Why don't you tell us about Oklahoma City, how it was upon your arrival?
The wife and I, with a newborn baby, left Philadelphia in May 1919. I'd just been discharged, and I came to Oklahoma City on June 12th, and she joined me a little bit later. My three brothers were already here, Victor and Ernest and Rex. Victor had the business going. Ernest was an optometrist in Ardmore, and Rex was with Victor. I joined Victor. I had a little money, and I put that in with it and became a member of the firm. And we went from there. At that time, Oklahoma City had about 90,000 population. It was quite small compared to today's spread. 23rd Street was way up north, and it extended west about 1/4 as far as it does now. It was a small place in a small town. Main Street, any building over 3 stories high was a skyscraper. And they had several skyscrapers. The Colcord building was the finest. And the Hayes building now, the First National Bank then, well, the State National they called it then, belonged to one of the Johnsons. And they were the only 2 over 5 stories high. The Main Street ran out at about, well, it wasn't much past Hudson, and Walker was the far end of it. We didn't have very much business down south of Broadway, not Broadway, but Grand Avenue. From there on down was just old houses and considered by many to be disreputable. Wheeler Park was a fine place for all the citizens of the southern part of the city to spend their Sundays frolicking around, and Belle Isle, 5 miles out, way out of Classen. Belle Isle was something. And if the children's special delight was to spend Sunday afternoon at Belle Isle. The hamburgers they made, I still remember, they were good. And the Chamber of Commerce occupied the 2nd floor of a building between Harvey and Hudson. And the manager of it, I've forgotten who it was. George Frederickson, I think, was head of it. But they brought in from... No, I believe... No, he might have been, but I believe it's George Frederickson. And they brought in a young fellow with lots of go from down in Georgia, Alabama, or somewhere. Anyhow, the southeastern part of the United States. And he stayed with that as the head of it, the operating head of it, for nearly 50 years. His name? What is his name? Stanley Draper. And Stanley Draper drove the men of Oklahoma City, the businessmen, unmercifully. He told them what they had to do, and they did it. And he built a Chamber of Commerce that performed, and is still performing. He laid the foundation of a mighty fine organization. My brother Victor and Draper were very, very close friends. And Victor spent what I thought at times was entirely too much time down there with Stanley making plans for the Chamber of Commerce. We did a lot of printing for them, though. I suppose that paid for it. That was in the early 20s. Now, we had a strike in 21. We'd made a nice bit of profit the 1st of May, but we had a strike that didn't do us any good. A bunch from Cleveland were ruling the printers. We were a union house, and the union boys came to us along in March, I think it was, and said, here's a new contract that headquarters in Cleveland say we have to get signed this year. Well, Victor took it and read it, and he said, there are 2 things in there that I can't sign. Well, that's what you have to sign it. That's what they said get, and that's what we're going to get. You have to sign it. Oh, no, he said, I don't have to sign it. I I want you to negotiate on these two items. They say, we can't negotiate. The headquarters has ordered us to get this signed, and we've got to get it signed. He said, I'm not going to sign it. Well, we'll have to walk out on you. He said, you walk out, you'll never come back. Well, he got his back up, and they got their back up, and they walked out. And on the morning of May 1st, they all came up there. Nobody reported for duty. They just stood. And at 8 o'clock, the strike was on. We had a bunch of fellows employed to come in and go to work. They went in and went to work. The strike was on, and we've never been union since. It lasted until Christmas. There was a little trouble. There was a little rather hard usage on the part of some of them. Some 2x4s were used as playthings, and a little shooting. It wasn't too bad, but it sure didn't do our finances any good. All summer and all fall, there was every morning, Keaton, Wells, and Johnson, attorneys at law, sent one of their men up to the police station to get the boys out. And, man, we got tired of that thing, and we lost our shirt that year. But we prospered a little bit during the 20s, like everybody else. We prospered. And I thought that I was able to drive a Packard. Found out later on I wasn't. But for a while, it was all right. And Oklahoma City was growing just like the dickens. It grew, from 18 and 20 to 19 and 30. I think it almost trebled. It grew. And it was an interesting time. Up to 19 and 29 October. And after that, it wasn't a joyful time. It was interesting, all right, but not joyful. And a lot of things happened in there. You want me to tell you about some of these governors?
Yeah. Let's hold that and then do those all at the same time.
Okay.
I'd like to ask a little more on the printing. What other printing firms were there at that time that during that early period?
Well, the Times Journal was a printing outfit. They were one of the larger ones. And Ray Warden of the Warden Company was one of the most prominent. All the Times Journal and Warden and Harlow's all depended on the capital printing for their bread and butter, and outside printing for profit. And we scrambled to beat the band to get the nice jobs of printing. They had printing over in the penitentiary, and such a scandal came of it that they threw the thing wide open for bid printing by other firms. And there was an outfit at Guthrie, the Cooperative Publishing Company at Guthrie. Were always in there making it pretty rough on the rest of us, because they had taken the old Capitol Publishing Company that went broke after the Capitol was moved, and a bunch of them who had been working in the organization had bought it for about 5 cents on the dollar, and they had an outfit or a printing plant that didn't cost them anything, and they could undercut us, and they made it pretty rough on us sometimes.
How about Norix?
Norrick, Lon Norrick was the moving genius in his place. He had a small plant, and I heard him say one day that in making prizes, just don't forget that when somebody comes in and wants printing, you have to lay down your stick and wash your hands, take off your apron, and go up there and spend a lot of time. So don't forget to charge him for that time. Make a price that'll pay you for the time you've lost in there. But he grew. His brother was with him, and they grew, and the youngsters came on, and the first thing you know, they hit on a form of bookkeeping for automobile companies, and they copyrighted it, and that's the foundation of the Norrick fortune. They went to town with it in a big way. And of course, the story of the Norricks now, Jim is mayor, is well known to everybody in the country. But the foundation was laid on that just one form, printed form, that they copyrighted.
Taking some of the personalities, you mentioned Stanley Draper. Let's take some of the other earlier personalities. Possibly, did you know Colcord?
I knew him only casually. He and Victor were good friends.
Who were some you knew?
I didn't know too many of them because I spent most of my time on the road. I was out traveling all the time trying to get business for the company, and I spent 25 years in there traveling. Sometimes, well, during the time I traveled on the trains, I averaged about, well, I'd say at least 12 days a week, counting the nights and the getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to catch a train going out somewhere.
When did you all get involved in school, in book publishing?
We started the books, printing the books in 1912, I believe. Harlow's Weekly was the start of the business, a magazine, a journal of comment and current events, political, of course. And that gave us entree into the schools, and we published our first books, I believe, in 17. And in 17, we got a contract with the state to publish the Oklahoma reports. So from then on, we published law books and school books. The law books were the principal publications, but they ran out after a while. The law field closed in. The gravy was all skimmed off by the time the 21 years passed. I believe that was the 11th or 12th, it was the 12th of April, 1932, I believe. 1928, maybe. 21 years after statehood. When is that? 28?
Yes.
Well, anyhow, the gravy had been skimmed off, and the thing just eased out from there on, faded out, and the school books in our business grew until by 1945 we went out of the law book business entirely, quit fooling with it. It had become so unprofitable, and we were making our money out of the other.
Tell us a little about Harlow's Weekly.
Harlow's Weekly was one of the most potent factors in government and in politics for, well, from about 1912 to 1935, or somewhere in there. Victor had an uncanny ability to sense what was going on among the politicians. He knew every one of them well, starting with his work in the Capitol with the Board of Affairs, and he could just almost tell what a man was going to do and what he was going to say. He was the most astute student of politics I've ever known. And, well, we did capitalize on it. It helped make things turn around. But after our strike, when we couldn't put the union label on our printing, we didn't do too much political printing.
You published some books about history and some books about personalities in Oklahoma during the 1920s. Could you tell us about those?
Yes, the weekly was very strong then. The radio hadn't come in, and of course TV was unknown. So the people looked to the Harlow's Weekly for the political information. They said if you read it in Harlow's, you can believe it, because we printed both sides of all the things that came up and printed without fear or favor. Didn't give a darn. We printed the way it looked like it was. And the politicians swore by it because they could believe it. It wasn't colored. And during that time, Rex wrote a couple of books. Victor wrote a book, Jesus the Man, that the story of the human side of Jesus' life. New York Times, in their book review of it in the Sunday magazine, said it is one of the 4 greatest books on Jesus that ever been published. At that time, the Italians' book was all the rage. But they classed this as one of the 4 great ones and listed them. I should have kept that page, and damn it, I didn't do it.
But tell us about Rex's books.
Rex wrote a book. He wrote several of them. He wrote a whole bunch of children's books, stories and things of that kind for children. But his big book was Oklahoma Leaders. That was a list of the strong men, the real leaders of Oklahoma, like Gaylord and, well, quite a number of the big names in Oklahoma at that time. And they helped defray the expense of the book. That's true. He wrote another one, Oklahoma Younger Leaders. That wasn't so successful, but the big book was.
The second was Oklahoma City, wasn't it? Oklahoma City Younger's Leader.
Not necessarily. It wasn't limited to Oklahoma City, but it was more than, most of them were in Oklahoma City. But it spread around over the state some. But the big book that he engineered was Makers of Government in Oklahoma. That was meant for a source book, a valuable asset to anybody who makes statewide campaigns. The names and the important information about the politicians all over the state, and got them all together by counties and gave the names and their birth and their politics and their connections, their church affiliations and their lodges, and all kinds of information that a man in Tulsa wanting to run for office could take that book and go down to Harmon County and see who in there he wanted to get on his list. And it was, well, one fella, he was a state candidate for office, and he offered us $5,000 if we would not let anybody else have any of those books. If we just sell him the whole edition, he'd give us $5,000. Well, of course, that was just a start for as far as the actual income from the book was concerned. But he thought that a book could be made for a little money. We didn't sell, and he didn't win.
You were acquainted with some of the governors, going back, I believe, to J.B.A. Robertson. Isn't that correct?
I was just barely acquainted with Jim Robertson. He was governor when I came here, and I never did have much to do with him. But his successors, his immediate successor, Jack Walton, I knew fairly well, and Walton's successor, Ed Trapp, I knew quite well.
Why don't you tell us a little about, let's start with Walton. Tell us a little about him from your knowledge and personal acquaintance.
Walton was a peculiar genius. He had his faults, and they were great. And he had his virtues, too. He was loyal to his friends, and he would stand hitched. But he didn't have too great conception of the difference. Well, I don't think he knew the difference between right and wrong, just to be frank about it. I believe he thought anything that he wanted he should have, and anything that he thought was right would be, and that's the way it ought to be. He was a lovable cuss, but he sure enough played whaley as governor.
Tell us about the build-up of his problems.
He appointed unfit men to a high position, and they ruined him. They just absolutely destroyed him because they thought that getting into office, being appointed to office, gave them the right to just all the graft they could put out, all they could collect. And they ruined old Jack with that. And then he ran foul of another thing. His wife, I think, was, if I'm not too badly informed, I think his wife was a Catholic, but I'm not sure. But he tangled with the Ku Klux Klan, and they got him. He went off his rocker when the legislature wanted to meet to talk about impeaching him. And he threatened to turn out the National Guard and prevent it. And he mounted a gun on the front steps of the Capitol. And he was ready to fight. He had his army and he could fight. But he saw the light and thought better of it and gave up, because they convinced him that all that would happen would be bloodshed and rioting and disturbance and destruction. So he finally backed down, and they met and impeached him. He afterwards ran for a state office and was elected to, I believe he was a commissioner, corporation commissioner, I believe he was elected. But he died a very disillusioned old man, very, and didn't have as many friends as he had when he was governor.
Dropping back a little bit, what about Henry Johnson, whom I believe was elected 4 years ahead of Walton?
No, Henry Johnson came after Walton.
Okay.
Walton followed Jim Robertson, and Trapp followed him, and Henry Johnson followed Trapp.
And then Holloway.
And then Holloway.
All right.
Trapp was the smartest one in the whole bunch.
Tell us about him.
Jack Walton had appointed a lot of unworthy men, but he also had appointed a lot of good men, and they were doing their job. When Ed Trapp took over after Walton been there 10 months, and that left Ed Trapp 3 years and 2 months, he had the idea that if you have a machine that's running and operating well, don't monkey with it. Let it operate. So these men who were good men in their places, Trapp kept. He didn't kick them out just because he was a new governor. Of course, he surrounded himself with his own friends. But he did not just jump in there and fire everybody that he could. And all the way down the line, things that had been operating, some of them not too well, but they were operating fairly smoothly, Trapp left alone. And that, I think, is a mark of a good executive. He was, to my way of thinking, his tenure as governor was accompanied by less trouble and less discomfort and less criticism than any other governors we've had, I think. He made one mistake. He said that he was acting governor, so he wanted to run for governor to succeed himself. The Constitution says no, and Trapp says, well, I'm not governor, I'm just Supreme Court said differently, and Trapp was out. So Henry Johnson came after him. Trapp made a lot of roads in this state. As a matter of fact, Trapp was the real father of the road system of Oklahoma. He appointed Cy Avery of Tulsa over there as head of the Highway Commission, and Avery was a man of considerable parts. And even though he did pave around his farm at state expense, he was a darn good highway commissioner, and Trapp was responsible for that. I admired him. I went to his office one day, and he was running for something, I believe lieutenant governor. That was before he became governor. And I had a printing bill, about $900, that I went out there to collect, and he started to write a check. He said, wait a minute, I can't pay this. Well, that hurt me because we needed the money. He said, I can't pay this. Don't you have a friend that can pay this for me? I said, well, I don't know. How about George Calvert? That's it. He called up, just took his telephone and called George Calvert. George, he said, Trapp, it looks like you owe Harlow's $900. Why don't you pay them? Well, he couldn't put it on his expense account. So George didn't have an expense account, so he paid it. And, of course, Trapp paid George Calvert back the loan that George had made him. Everything was all right and above board. Trap was shrewd. Oh, that boy was shrewd. And some of his enemies, he had them. I was over at Sepulpa one day, and some of the boys over there were telling me of some of the machinations of Ed Trapp in the bond business. So I came back to the office on Saturday, and I told Victor about it. I said we ought to investigate that. And Victor looked at me for a moment. He said, boy, you don't investigate your friends. We didn't investigate Trapp. I don't know if there's anything to it or not. Never did want to, no.
Now, I believe following Trapp was Johnson.
Following Trapp, Henry Johnson.
Did you know him?
Yes.
Can you tell about him?
There was one of the most maligned gentlemen that ever occupied the governorship in Oklahoma. He was a soul of honor. He paid his debts. His word was good. He just had one bad fault. That has been the downfall of many a great man. He had a roving eye. And his friends knew it and loved him in spite of it, because he was a lovable character. They impeached him for incompetence. Well, his incompetence was his inability to see the political effects of some of his ideas, and his unwillingness to compromise his principles for the sake of convenience in government and handling the affairs of state. Now, that's all there was to it. Of course, now, his secretary was the immediate cause of his downfall, Mrs. Hammond. She controlled him, controlled his thinking, I think. She dominated him is a better word to use. For instance, one day Clint Hargis of Pawhuska, a long-time personal friend of Henry Johnson, went in to see the governor, and Mrs. Hammond wouldn't let him in to see him. He said the governor's busy. Well, old Clint sat around the office there for a while, and finally he got tired of it, and he went over to the door, and Mrs. Hammond got in his way. He just raised his arm and swept her to one side. He says, "Oh, hell, woman, get out of the way. I came to see Henry Johnson." And in he went. And Henry Johnson was in there alone, and he looked up, "Hello, Clint. Glad to see you. How long have you been waiting?" Well, it didn't take very many of that kind of occurrences to set the hair on a lot of Henry Johnson's friends, who, when his enemies, and he had them, when his enemies got after him, his friends wouldn't defend him, because they had received the same kind of treatment at the hands of Miss Hammond. He left office owing us over $1,000. He paid every cent of it. Afterwards, out of his law practice, I don't think Henry Johnson ever took a dime to which he was not entitled. I think he had the soul of a gentleman. I love the old booger myself.
What was the basis of his problems in office, leading to his impeachment?
Principally, the resentment of too many powerful people against Mrs. Hammond. They didn't have a thing. They couldn't put their fingers on anything wherein Henry Johnson had failed. So they just impeached him on the question of incompetence. That's all. They just pronounced him incompetent to run the office because he couldn't keep the woman in her place, and he wouldn't get rid of her.
Did you know Governor Holloway?
Yes. Casually. He was a customer of mine down at Hugo, a young fellow down there. Bought books from me. Pretty nice chap. He hated Bill McAllister's guts. Going back a little bit, the man who elected Jack Walton governor was George B. Rittenhouse. Rittenhouse was a kingmaker. He was the most powerful one man in Oklahoma in politics at that time. In politics, which means also in government. George Rittenhouse. And he elected Jack Walton. And
until he was killed in an automobile accident, Jack Walton was safe. But after he was killed, then the enemies jumped on old Jack and fixed him. Well, he was succeeded as king by Bill McAllister of Hugo. Bill McAllister was elected Secretary of the State Senate, which made him Secretary of the State Election Board. And he controlled election boards all over the state, and that made him a kingmaker. And Bill Holloway hated his guts. So when he became governor, his first move was to get Bill McAllister kicked out of his job as Secretary of the Senate. Well, how could he do it? The Senate by that time, this was in 1920, 08 or 9, somewhere along there. By that time, the Senate had become an oligarchy. They almost ruled the state, and Bill McAllister was the man who said this man and that man and that man, and made it stick. But Bill Holloway got him out. I want to ask you a hypothetical question. Suppose you were governor of a state, and you had a mother-in-law living with you who was so inconsiderate as to die while at your house. You'd want to give her a good funeral, wouldn't you?
Right.
Well, suppose you had some friends in the road building business, and you were worried you didn't have enough money to give her the kind of funeral you'd like to have given her, so you'd just take your worries downtown to one of the tall buildings, and you'd go call on one of your personal friends and ask for his advice and seek his counsel. Suppose he'd offer to lend you about $750, which is the cost of a funeral then. Would you gratefully take it?
I probably would.
Well, suppose you'd leave his office and you'd go over to see another friend, and darn if you'd not have the same experience, would you take that? Suppose you'd go to a third friend, and after a little conversation, he'd offer to lend you $1,000. Would you borrow it?
I don't know. I want to see what you're leading to.
After Holloway, we had a governor named Bill Murray. Bill Murray, oh, what a character. Now, there's where we can write a book. And Gordon Hines did. Bill Murray was a brilliant animal, crude, coarse, uncouth, rough, rugged, profane, frequently obscene. The utterly lacking in all the graces, all of them. But in the realm of government, he was supreme. And he knew more about government than any other 5 men with whom he came in contact. But he could repel more people in less time than any other human being that I ever saw. And he could disgust people more, and he could insult more people, and man, woman, or child. I saw him one day come out of his office with his inevitable scarf dangling down in front of him, and he looked as though he hadn't had a bath or even washed his face and ears in a week. And somebody said something to him, and he put his hand up to his ear like that. He said, "Hey!" That was Bill Murray. One side of him. The other side was shrewd, calculating, philosophizing. Bill Murray called me one day at noon. This was about 33 or some such. It was while the banks were down. It was right in the very worst part of the early 30. See, he This must have been the 33. Anyhow, things were rough. Things were awfully rough. He went to Washington and came back with instructions from the powers that be in Washington to get a lot of forms made and ready to put out these relief checks and things of that kind. It was just about 12 o'clock, or maybe a little after, on Saturday. Everybody had gone home except one man. The foreman of the press room hadn't left yet. And Bill Murray called and said, "I want," and he roared, as he always did, "I want a lot of printing done." I said, "Well, we can't print anything for you. We're closed for the weekend." "Well, I want this, and I want it by noon tomorrow. I've come back from Washington, and I've got to get this stuff out," and he went to rattling off what he had to have. I said, "Bill Murray, our governor, there isn't a plant in the state of Oklahoma that can do that. Well, it's got to be done anyhow. Now, I want you to do it. Get it out and get it out here by noon tomorrow." I said, "All right, it's impossible, but you'll have it." So I turned to the foreman who had stood there and heard it. Our superintendent had just left for Arkansas. Victor was out of town. This was summertime. And I said, "Ray, we have it to do." The next day, we delivered by noon the next day $1,200 worth of printing to that old bugger. Checks, vouchers, forms, gee whiz. We didn't any of us sleep. The foreman got busy and he got together the boys that worked there, and we put it out and delivered it out there to him. "You know that bill?" He said, "I don't know when I'll be able to pay you. Don't have any money now." That bill ran up to $40,000 before we got any money. And as soon as we got our money, then all the other printers ran in and wanted to print for him. He said, "Hell no. When I had to have printing, Harlow's printed for me. None of you other fellows would do anything for it because I didn't have any money. Harlow did. Now get out. Go away and leave me alone." So we had a lot of printing for that old booger. Oh, he was a character. He was a character.
Can you think of any other experiences with him?
Oh, give me a little time and I'll give you a dozen, but just offhand. That's just...
Well, let's see. Following Murray was Marlin, wasn't it?
Marlin.
Can you tell us about him?
Not too much. Marlin was a rich oil man, and he tried to run the state the way he ran his company. And he found himself, before he knew what happened, in the toils of the Young Turks. And there were a bunch of those fellows, some of them his employees and some of them his friends, who were keen and shrewd and unscrupulous as they could be. And they dealt him a lot of misery before he finally got squared around with him. But he came in at the fag end of the Depression, and things were beginning to pick up and look better, and everybody was feeling so much better, and they were happy because of that. And of course the governor was responsible. He was the man that had made everything better when he hadn't done a darn thing. I think that his administration was one of the least spectacular of all of the governors I've known. And when he passed out of the picture, the people just forgot him, practically.
I believe following that was Phillips, 1940.
Red Phillips. Oh, Shaw. Red Phillips put this state financial situation into a sound operation. He did a good job of it. He was another, some people referred to him as a big red bull, which he was more or less. He was a bull on the football field of Oklahoma University, and he was a bull in office. But he was a pretty doggone good governor. Like everybody else, he enjoyed game poker. I didn't see this. I just heard it. That he had got into a poker game one night down in Hot Springs, Arkansas, with a bunch of oil men. And he had a farm or a ranch over there in Okla County, and he had a lot of white-faced cattle. By golly, he won a $2,500 bull that night in that session at poker. And I guess he was lucky. But he was a pretty good governor.
Did you have any personal relationship with him?
Not much. I was in his office only a few times. Most of my acquaintance with him was in his office as a lawyer over in Okima. Rowe, Phillips, and Douglas was the name of it. Rowe was the financial man. Phillips was the trial lawyer. And Douglas was the cub, the young fellow that they took in with them. Rowe handled the finances and handled the business end of the operation. Back there in those days, a prosperous law firm had to have a business manager. For instance, there was a couple over at Wewoka that Pryor and Stokes. Pryor was a lawyer, and Stokes was a railroad man, and he was admitted to practice, and they prospered. Whenever anybody needed a lawyer, they would see Pryor, and he'd say, yes, I'll handle this, and so forth. Well, how much is it going to cost? See Stokes. And Stokes would fix the fee. He'd say, now, here, you're getting the services of one of the finest lawyers in the Southwest, and it's going to cost you, but you're going to get the service. So he'd just jack up the fee to beat the dickens, and they had prospered. But they delivered, too, because they defended some of the criminals in that country that needed defending badly. Stokes was very fortunate with him.
Following Phillips.
Wasn't that
Kerr, wasn't it?
Bob Kerr? Yes. There was an interesting character. Great, big, overgrown country boy. Got out of the University of Oklahoma with a license to practice law. Opened up a law office in Ada, his hometown. Became elected county judge, and one of the most popular county judges that ever occupied that office in Oklahoma. He seemed to enjoy doing things for people. And when he left there, he had Oklahoma and Pontotoc County in the hollow of his hand, just because he loved to do things for people. Made them like it, and he liked them. He could have anything they could offer him. So, he showed, immediately after he left that office, he showed signs of great acumen. He made a partnership with Lowry Harrell, who was a real honest-to-God lawyer. And then they took in a young fellow or two to do the footwork. Well, the people flocked into Bob Kerr for legal service. And Lowry Harrell gave it to them, and they prospered. And then came Fitztown and the oil boom. And Phillips Petroleum looked down there, now we must have a local attorney. Who? And they said, well, Bob Kerr, that's the fellow, most popular lawyer in there, and his lawyer, Harrell, is one of the finest lawyers in this state. Why, there's no choice, that's it. Well, they had business with and for the Phillips Petroleum, and Frank Phillips took a liking to Kerr. And he told him, this is a good buy, Bob. Here, you can get in on this. That helps. That's good. First thing you know, Bob Kerr had more oil business and more oil money coming his way, and he was on his way to becoming a multimillionaire. Frank Phillips is the boy that did it, and Bob Kerr got it because of his liking for people. Just a great, big, friendly fellow. And he carried that with him till his death. He had more personal friends than you can shake a stick at. He made us a good governor. He didn't have to graft. He was rich. He didn't have to graft at all. And he was a keen politician. He had developed that. Oh, heck, it was natural with him. He was just as natural a politician as you ever saw. And very, very personable. And he was popular just as he could be. It's a darn shame that he died as early as he did. But his administration was smooth. He knew how. And you never heard a breath of scandal. You never heard any complaint of people raising Cain about him. The Republicans didn't try to defeat him. They knew it wasn't any use. By long odds, the most popular governor Oklahoma ever had. And he was followed by a man who just did a real good job, Roy Turner. He was a business man. He ran the office of governor just the way a businessman would run it. And he did a good job. Just kept the thing going smoothly. Of course there was graft and corruption. You go back in history and you'll find it clear all the way back. It's always been. You'll never have a government. I heard a man once say that if you can get 75 cents worth of value out of the tax dollar, you're having a very fine government. Well, that sounds pretty big. In other words, well, for instance, when Jim Robertson was governor, they put on a campaign to raise $60 million, and bonds put out a bond issue of $60 million for good roads. And that was in 1921. A man over in Tulsa told me one day, he said, you know, if I could be assured that Roy Hoffman and his gang down there wouldn't get over 10 million of that, I'd vote for it. He was a man who knew his way about, a realist. Well, he was allowing there, you see, 10 out of 60, that's 16%. But the other man, the student of politics, gave him 25. So he was saying, we just have a fine government if it doesn't cost us over 10 million graft. You can't have a government without graft. Going to be some of it? Fellow who thinks you can't, he just better go and learn something.
Following Turner was Johnson Murray.
Yes. Next.
Did you know Johnson Murray?
Oh, casually. Casually is all. Casually. Johnson Murray was not always governor. Willie was governor a lot of the time. And she was governor enough, that's his wife, she was governor enough that she decided she'd be elected on her own. And that's the biggest mistake she ever made. Poor woman, I think she died of cancer. She died not very long after that campaign. But she didn't have a ghost of a chance. But I think she was as much governor as Johnson was. And he wasn't much.
Did you have, how about Raymond Gary?
He was another nice chap. And he was a member of the Senate oligarchy. So he had the Senate with him all the time, and they worked smoothly and attended to government in the ways that the powers that be decide should be done, and everything moved along pretty well.
Did you have any personal relationship with him?
Oh, I sold him. I had, before he became governor, he was a customer of mine. I used to go down and sell him stuff and collect for him. He was pretty hard up most of the time. He didn't have any money when he was elected governor. I don't think he took any personal, just straight out graft. I don't believe it. I've no doubt that he did use his office of governor in practical ways, but I don't think he used them in crooked ways, just practical.
After that, we move into the newer breed of governors. I don't know whether you had any personal that's Edmondson, Bellman, and Bartlett. Did you have any personal relationship there?
None whatever, except with Bellman a time or two, but just practically none with those three.
Of the people you've known over the period of years, not necessarily in government, who would you feel are the, you mentioned Stanley Draper, but who else would you feel are the real principal leaders or the people who have caused things to happen more than any other people?
Well, that's awfully hard to answer. That's awfully hard to answer.
You want to try a few? Just name a few.
Let me see. Topping list, of course, is E.K. Gaylord. He has been in the middle of everything that's ever been done in this state. Frank Buttram was a little help along.
Can you tell us anything about him?
Frank Buttram, well, his operation, his contribution to the government of Oklahoma was slight. He was just a young fellow, came out of the university and did well in oil. Gaylord's a big boy. Old Bob Williams was a powerful influence in the early days of. Here I see a name of a man that stood pretty high in the saddle in his profession, and through his influence with his friends, helped a lot to promote Oklahoma City, and that was Dr. Leroy Long, a gentleman and a scholar and a very, very, very fine surgeon. Sam Hayes, also a lawyer here in town. He kept his name out of the spotlight most of the time, but he was into it up to his neck all the time. Ed Overholser. Judge Vaught, Ed Vaught. He was very fine. He was superintendent of schools here once. Then he became an attorney and was appointed to the district bench, the United States District Court. And he was a very, very potent factor in the development of Oklahoma City.
How about J.F. Owens? Did you know him?
J.F. Owens was president of the OG&E, and he was right in the forefront of every movement that came along for the benefit or betterment of Oklahoma City.
How about George A. Davis?
He followed J.F. Owens, and he stayed in there and kept up the good work with him as much. Elmer Thomas. One of the big men of Oklahoma who's been forgotten was the great United States Senator Robert L. Owens, the father of the now attacked Federal Reserve System. Federal Reserve System is in disrepute now. Say, have you seen lately a silver certificate or a gold certificate?
No, not recently.
Everything is Federal Reserve notes.
Right.
And that's the money of the United States.
Right.
And is the Federal Reserve, is that part of the United States government?
No.
No, it's not. So today, a privately owned organization rules the money of the United States. Robert L. Owens didn't foresee that, but that's what has developed from it. A bunch of these names in here are the older men. R.K. Wooten, Chickasha, was a power all over the southwestern part of the state in his Chickasha cotton oil mill, or cotton oil, whatever it was. He helped develop the economy of southwestern Oklahoma more than any other one man. And his operation, his name, was pretty well forgotten now.
Is that father of Bob Wooten here, or grandfather?
Probably grandfather. He was a powerful figure in everything that was done here. George Frederickson was at the forefront of a lot of that stuff. Wherever it came along, they were always looking for J.F. Owens and George Frederickson to spearhead it, and they both did it. Frederickson was the Oklahoma Natural Gas.
How about Harvey Everett?
He was, well, let's call him, he would be a brigadier general in that group, where the others were majors. His contribution was much, but less than those I've mentioned.